Recently in Ireland, we've heard a lot about the dangers of far-right extremist ideologies. We see headlines like this from the Times. Risk of attack by right-wing extremists in Ireland is substantial, and this is specifically referring to attacks on public representatives. Now, of course, no such far-right attack on politicians has actually taken place to date. This is a hypothetical imagined future attack that may or may not occur in some people's opinion. And meanwhile, we have military bases in Galway which are actually being attacked in real life, with a priest being stabbed by a suspected Islamist extremist. This was not an imagined theoretical stabbing. This is a real stabbing that just took place a few days ago. And yet, in the aftermath of this possible Islamist attack, the media wants to talk about the far right for reasons which are best known to themselves. So it's at this point that I think it would be useful to go over the actual data and facts regarding terror offences in Ireland and who generally commits them, because I think it paints a very different picture to the one the media would like to portray. Every year, Europol, the EU's official law enforcement agency, releases a report called the EU Terrorism Situation and Trend Report. It outlines terrorism arrests and trends in each EU member state, broken down by category. And one of the terror categories that's frequently listed in that report is ethno-nationalist or separatist movements, although Europol explains that in an Irish context, this means dissident Republicans. The ethno-nationalist and separatist arrests in Ireland were all in connection with dissident Republican groups, the report reads. So what exactly is the ideology of said dissident Republican groups? Well, Europol explains that these groups are socialists who are affiliated with left-wing extremists and Marxists. Dissident Republican groups aim to reunite Ireland with Northern Ireland and create a 32-county socialist republic in Ireland. Dissident Republican groups continue to have associations with left-wing extremists and have travelled to take part in socialist or Marxist events across the EU, including Spain and Greece. They also have close links to some groups in Palestine, sharing a perceived similar struggle. As a brief aside, by the way, Europol also notes the danger of environmental extremists in Europe, which you never hear mentioned in the Irish media. Another example concerns left-wing extremists in Ireland who are campaigning against perceived British, EU and American imperialism and actively targeting senior citizens who have previously been involved in the Republican movement for recruitment purposes. Left-wing extremists have also been reported at various environmental demonstrations and activities in 2022. There are sympathies and some overlap between left-wing extremists and environmental activists and extremists. The two phenomena pursue partially overlapping goals and have common topics of interest. For example, both see the construction of high-speed railway lines or gas pipelines as harmful to nature and representative of the capitalist state. Now, there's something you won't read on RTE. So why am I bringing all of this up? What's my point? Well, when you go back over a decade or so of Europol terrorism reports between 2012 and 2022, you find that around 81% of terrorism arrests in the Republic of Ireland involve far-left dissident Republicans. The next biggest category are jihadists at 13.2%, followed by not specified at 3.8%, and a measly 1.9% are classified as right-wing. For those who are wondering about the nature of the jihadist arrests, by the way, those are mostly financing of terror overseas rather than direct attacks. It's largely individuals living in Ireland but sending money to ISIS or some other group like that. Although a few years ago we had a de-radicalized Irish Islamist telling the media that she personally knew of as many as 150 extremist Muslims living in Ireland who saw the country as a soft touch and who she believed would eventually carry out attacks here.
We talked about there being a big presence of radical extremists in Ireland.
Yeah, there's at least 100 to 150 max minimum.
And what kind of things did they talk about?
They just talked about people that, about targeting, about what was happening, about the infidel, like they wanted to kill basically the non-Muslims.
And they thought that Ireland was a soft place to hide?
Yeah, they thought Ireland was a soft touch. I know that they will eventually, I'm sure that they will attack Ireland.
Moreover, a few years back, Islamist terrorist Rashid Redouane went on a killing spree in London that left 7 people dead and 48 injured, and he had lived in Rathmines in Dublin. So clearly there is a contingent of radical Islamists within this country. Now, it goes without saying that all extremism is appalling and unacceptable, all violent radicalism needs to be cracked down on, regardless of ideology, right-wing, left-wing, or otherwise. But with Europol telling us that 81% of Irish terrorism arrests over the last decade or so were left-wing socialist dissidents, while just 1% were right-wing, it's worth asking, why is the media so focused on the 1% and not the 81%? After all, the media's tunnel vision on this issue is very apparent. For example, we all remember the terrible case of Justice Minister Helen McEntee having a bomb threat called in against her family home, which is obviously completely unacceptable, but many journalists and politicians were very quick to insinuate or infer that this threat was issued by some kind of right-wing lunatic who was upset about immigration.
The rhetoric that we're seeing around immigration, particularly online, as you said, is a type of rhetoric that we've never really seen before in Irish politics. And it has turned really nasty. In one incident that I think really troubled a lot of people, your home was targeted. And there was a bomb scare phoned in that resulted in your young family having to be moved out.
Now, this is a completely baseless and unsubstantiated view. At this point, we have no idea who threatened McEntee, what their ideology was, or why they might have done it. But one thing we do know is that the threat was made via an anonymous call to the Samaritans charity. As reported by the Irish Times, the bomb threats were made in separate phone calls, one to the Samaritans charity. Now, why is that significant, you ask? Why bring up that detail? Well, because this follows the exact same formula as an earlier bomb threat to Helen McEntee that was made shortly beforehand. Again, as reported by the Irish Times, earlier this year, a convicted rapist who made a hoax bomb threat to Miss McEntee's home from the Midlands prison was told that he would spend an additional 2 years in prison. He also made the call through the Samaritans. The man behind that previous bomb threat was a violent career criminal with 40 previous convictions. So what was his political affiliation, if he has one? Was he a far-right extremist or right-wing agitator? Well, no. In the threat, he specifically referenced a left-wing socialist paramilitary group, and he further claimed to be formerly affiliated with that group during subsequent interviews with the Gardaí. He also claimed to have knowledge of what former group members outside the prison were doing, and the Sunday World described him as a man with paramilitary links. In a 2010 statement, this group said that their goal is to, quote, take war to the heart of the, quote, capitalist apparatus in Ireland, and that they see it as their, quote, duty as revolutionaries to persuade the working class to embrace socialism. So to recap here, a person who claimed to be formerly affiliated with a far-left socialist dissident group threatened to bomb Helen McEntee via an anonymous call to the Samaritans. Then, immediately after he was convicted of that offence, another very similar bomb threat was called on McEntee in the exact same format. And what does the media conclude? Well, it must have been the far right. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Now, again, I would emphasize we don't know who was responsible for the second bomb threat against McEntee, but there is absolutely no evidence currently available in the public domain that it was done by a right-wing person. If anything, the evidence seems to point in the opposite direction. So why is the media determined to give off the impression that this was in relation to immigration protests when there is no evidence for that at all? We all know that extremism is a serious problem that needs to be dealt with regardless of ideology. And of course, right-wing extremism is real. Every ideology and belief system in the world has its radical fringe. But if people insist on making this a left versus right issue, then we can't ignore the fact that the data clearly shows that Ireland has a much bigger left-wing extremism problem than a right-wing one. That's just a cold, hard statistical fact. Yet we spend all our time talking about the 1% and almost none talking about the 81%. If you ask me, a little bit of balance in this discussion would go a long way.